So now we're going to switch things up and hopefully address the concerns for the beginners. So right now, I believe we don't have a firm, is that right, Tim? We don't have a firm time for the nucleus colonies to arrive. It's either the last weekend, the last Saturday in April, or the first of May.
Dave is still thinking he's heading down next week, which would make it the 24th, but that's not been confirmed.
Okay, so we're still anticipating a confirmed date for the nucleus colonies to arrive. So as soon as we find out from our supplier, then we will obviously let all the members know. Anyone who's on the list as a purchaser, we'll let you know where we stand when that time comes. Okay, so once we do find out when the big day is, there are some things that are going to be happening behind the scenes. So for all the purchasers who show up the morning of the event, here's a rundown on what you will miss. That these are the things that are going on so that you can pick up your bees. So once Dave and Laura find out, they're going to drive the truck down to Louisiana and pick up these nucleus colonies, bring them back in the late hours of the night, and leave them in St. Louis, where we and a bunch of volunteers are going to get up at the crack of dawn and go over and take the tarp off and then screen all the entrances to these nucleus colonies so that the bees are in the boxes and that the entrances are closed. And then we will have the parking lot will be set up in such a way that we're hoping to speed things up, and you will arrive and Laura or another person will be there with a clipboard. They'll take your name and they'll probably give you tickets for either feeders, if you bought feeder buckets, and how many nucleus colonies that you'll be picking up. And so we're going to try to divide it a little differently than we did last year and make it where you pull up and assistants and helpers will be there to help load the bees in the back of your vehicles, and then you can pull forward and secure your load before you depart. So what do you need to do as a beekeeper to prepare for this big day? Hopefully your equipment would look a little different than the equipment I'm leaning on. So this is fully assembled equipment, but this equipment has not been painted. So you'll want your equipment to be prepared. You'll want it painted or sealed or stained or whatever surface treatment you prefer. You would want to have your hive stand ready. You would want to have some sugar syrup mixed up. Most of the time when I'm making sugar syrup, it's 1-to-1 in the springtime, meaning 1 part sugar to 1 part water. And you'd want to mix that sugar syrup up. And sugar dissolves better in warm water or hot water. And then I want to do it ahead of time so that the water can cool. So I usually do it the night before. And I mix it up in a 5-gallon bucket so that I can pour it into a feeder of your choice, whatever feeder design you use. For demonstration purposes tonight, I've got a 1-gallon bucket feeder. So you'd want to have your equipment ready. You'd want to have your bee protection ready. You would have wanted to practice using a smoker a couple different times. A smoker, especially your first season, it seems as anytime you want to use your smoker, it'll be out. It'll puff and be smoking on the sidelines, but when you reach for it, it'll be out, and then you got to stop what you're doing and then relight the smoker. So getting a handle on that skill set is something that's done by practicing it, and I encourage you to do that, a couple times before your bees get there, so you have an idea of how to keep a smoker going. When you get there, we're going to be there to help you load your bees. You may not even have to get out of the vehicle at that point until you want to secure your load. But give some thought to the vehicle that you're coming in. Give some thought to how you're going to secure this box of bees in your vehicle. So most of the bees are on the inside and they're locked inside, but occasionally there are a few stragglers that are on the outside of the box. If this is going in the back of your pickup truck, maybe you should think about how are you going to keep this from sliding around? Do you have something you can put in the bed of your truck to keep it from going anywhere? Some straps, a rubber mat, something to keep it from falling or flipping over if you have to stop suddenly. So give some thought to that, because that's important when you're carrying precious cargo. When you do pick up these boxes, and this is actually one of the boxes that was part of a previous nuke delivery from the club, and I had to make a different lid for it, but it's made out of a thin plywood. So as I take this lid off, you'll find I removed a frame already, but it's just a thin plywood box. It's not made for long-term storage. It works great for what it is, and that is just a temporary nucleus box. Usually the provider has a couple screws in the lid to secure the lid, and we try to watch that when we're unloading to make sure the lids are screwed down properly. But when you're carrying a nucleus colony, you'd always want to carry it from the bottom. You wouldn't want to ever try to support the weight and trust, you know, the 2 screws or 3 screws that are in this to hold, because if those give way and you're holding it from the lid, the bottom is going to fall off and land at your feet, and you're going to have a bunch of upset bees right at your feet, and that's not going to be pleasant as your first entry into beekeeping. What if the weather's bad? Last year it was raining whenever we delivered the nukes. We were all drenched in the process. I think it cleared up later that day, you know, but until then, what should you be doing with your bees? And so we use some 1/8 inch hardware cloth, which is basically thicker screen wire that has holes that are 1/8 inch big. And we fold it into a V, and we insert this into the entrance of the colony, and that's what keeps the bees on the inside. So if you find that the day that you pick up your nucleus colony, it's too cold, then what we recommend you do is your more permanent hive is set on your stand, and that you would just place your nucleus colony on top of your stand, okay? And at a minimum, you need to pull the screen out. So you'd probably want to have your bee suit on, and you'd want to pull over here and pull off the screen so that the bees can fly if it warms up, until you have an opportunity to properly transfer them into the 10 frame equipment. Okay, so when you're transporting the bees, it's important to keep them cool. So if you have an SUV, you can put them in the back. You never know what the weather's going to be, but if it's warm, you maybe turn the air conditioner on. You know, most of the time that's not necessary, but it's important that the bees are locked in this box and they can't thermoregulate like they normally would. And so keeping them comfortable is important. So I'm going to kind of get into now the installation process and the way that I install nucleus colonies. And I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, because there's always usually a lot of questions when it comes to this. So I would have my hive stand ready, as I talked about earlier. I'd have my hive box, all this equipment you see here ready to go, painted and on the stand. And assuming it's going to be a beautiful day, you'd want to leave from picking up the nucleus colony at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, which is where we've held all of our nuke deliveries in recent memory. You'd want to leave from there and go to your bee yard. You know, colonies like this are perishable, so you've got to make sure to keep them cool and then take them to where they're going. And so I would have my bee suit on, I'd have my smoker lit, and I would have my hive tool, I'd have my sugar syrup in my bucket feeder, if I'm using a bucket feeder, whatever feeder you're using, having your sugar syrup ready for that. And after I've lit my smoker, we're going to assume the screen is still in it here. I'm going to have my screwdriver, because as I said earlier, we might have a couple screws on the lid, keeping the lid secure. And I'm going to have my smoker lit, my suit on, my tools ready, and I'm going to begin the process. So what I would do would be to puff a couple puffs of smoke right at the entrance, give that a couple seconds, and then I would take my screwdriver and pull the 3 or 4 screws out so that the lid will then be released. Before I take off the lid, giving these bees a few seconds to kind of react from the smoke, I'm going to have my colony here. I'm going to take off the outer cover, and outer covers, when you take them off, usually it's good to get in the habit of turning them upside down, okay? Anytime I do a bee inspection, I always turn the outer cover upside down so that if I have to move a box, I can set it on this and I don't crush bees that are on the bottom side. Okay, so my outer cover comes off, my inner cover comes off, and I'm transferring 5 frames into this box that holds 10 frames. I want to give myself some room. So 10 minus 5 is 5. 5 divided by 2 is going to be 3 and 2. Okay, so I'm going to have 3 frames on one side of this cluster and 2 frames on the other. So it doesn't matter. So I'm going to leave these 3 frames here, and then I'm going to remove those. That's my 5 that I've got to remove to make room for this. But I'm also going to remove another one to give myself a little more room. Okay, that way I'm not crowded when I'm trying to put frames in. Just makes it easier on you. Okay, so I would then at this point maybe a little puff of smoke, and then I would use my hive tool and get underneath this lid and pull this lid up. And when you're pulling off a lid, occasionally the bees will secure the top of the frame to the lid. And so you go to lift this frame, the lid off, and it feels like it's stuck. And so usually what I recommend is that once you lift, inevitably what's going to happen is as soon as you create a space, bees are going to go there. Okay. And so I don't want to lift and then push back down. I want to lift and hold. And if I don't have the lid come off easily, I want to look down. And if there is a frame for some reason that has wax attached to it, I'll use my hive tool to slide in here and then to pry that frame down so I can easily lift this outer cover of the nuke off. Okay, just like this outer cover, I'm going to flip it over. Okay, I'm going to give it a quick scan to see if I see the queen. Okay, it's very doubtful she'd be on the lid, but I just want to give it a quick look just to make sure. I'll set it off out of the way. Okay, and then these frames will be just like so in the box. I'll take a puff of smoke or 2 here, and you'll notice that the reaction on the bees part is to run from the smoke. And so there'll be bees covering the top here, but as soon as I apply a puff or 2 of smoke, the bees will run down, exposing these top bars, which is great because you need to be able to grab those to lift those top bar or these frames out and transfer them into this box. So this is the hive tool that I prefer. There are other hive tool designs that work perfectly well, but I would use this to pry. If I lift this box up, maybe it'd be easier for the camera to see. If I put this hive tool between 2 frames and I use a little leverage here, it pulls that frame apart, and I go over here and do the same thing. Okay, right where these sidebars are is where the bees will connect and use propolis to make those fill those cracks and crevices, and it makes those frames want to stick together. So I just pull it apart slightly, and then I use the J end on my hive tool to hook down into the frame. I usually do this side first. I lift it up and grab it, and then I lift this side up, and then I come straight up as straight as I can go with it. Okay, and then I grab it by the end bars. Okay, and when you grab your frame here, it allows you to pivot it this way and to look this way without having to readjust your grip. You want to get out of the habit, or never start the habit, of moving your hands around a lot, because the bees will be all over here. And so you're trying to minimize crushing bees, and you just want to take a quick look. The outer frame will probably be mostly honey, maybe some pollen. And so I want to put that frame, and the goal is to transfer these 5 frames in order, in the same orientation. The entrance is up front, the entrance is up front. I want to transfer these 5 frames one at a time over into this box. And so I would lower this frame down, and then if I don't see the queen, I always tell people that this is the smallest your hive will be probably. If you're going to try to look for your queen, it's a good idea to do that now. Try to find and try to identify what brood looks like, what drones look like, what drone brood looks like, what the queen looks like, what honey, what pollen, what bee bread, all those different things that you've read about. Here's your first opportunity to get a visual and to look and see what these things look like in real life. So refresh yourself, go to the computer and type in, what does pollen look like? What does capped honey look like? It's important that you understand what those things look like because we're getting ready to see them. So I then go to the second frame. I do the same thing. I pry. If the bees have come up, if you've taken, a few seconds longer to look at this frame, well, the bees will slowly make their way back up here. So before you grab the second frame, maybe you have to just puff, puff. Sometimes you don't have to. It all depends on how the bees are responding. And so then once I pull that apart, with the first frame gone, I've got more room in here. So I can use my fingers usually and pull it back and then lift it out. The J tool part, the prying tool, is useful for the first frame, but most of the time, that's the only time I really need that. Usually once you get the first frame, which is kind of tight, it's easier to pull the other frames out. And so again, I hold it on its end and I position it where I really only have 2 fingers on each hand. And I'm looking at what I'm trying to see. I'm trying to see that I see brood. Does it look healthy? Is it white and pearly? Is it in the design and shape that you see in the pictures? If it is, great. It doesn't have to be. Most of the time you'll see brood in kind of a semicircle with pollen above that and then honey in the corners. And if it looks like that, it's like the textbook, like the bees have been reading the same books you have, and that's ideal. But sometimes it doesn't look like that, but as long as everything looks healthy, that's your main goal. So I then transfer that frame in and then continue to do these other frames. This one has a piece of black plastic foundation. That's what makes it nice if you're trying to see eggs at the bottom of the cells. The little translucent eggs really show up well against the black foundation. So I put that in. I do the next frame. I take a look at it. If I see the queen, great. Then I know she's there and she's safe. If I transfer these frames in, do my last frame, then what I want to do at that point is I now have 9 frames in the box and I want to add my 10th frame. Okay. So when I'm putting these frames in, I'm trying to make sure, this will be an easier way to demonstrate it, where these frames touch. If I'm getting that in the camera, let me see if I can move that here. Right here is where the frames are touching. As you see down below here, there's an open spot, okay? And so when I slide these frames together, I want to make sure that I'm not crushing bees where those 2 frames bump together there. And so just be mindful of that whenever you're doing this transfer. So I have my 10th frame, and so these frames are all put together. They're touching each other. And so usually what I'll do is use my hive tool, and I can go over here and apply some pressure here and slide these frames to the center, all of them touching, and I've got my last frame that'll go in right here. Once I've done that, the last thing I want to do as far as the frame alignment is make sure with my hive tool that there is equal space on this side and this side. So there has to be room for the bees to get up along the sidewalls here. And where my hive tool is going, they have to be able to get in here and here to build comb and to defend that comb, so that if there are hive beetles or something like that, they have to be able to get to it. Too often, when I help other beginners out, I find that they are careless about this, and that the spacing is all over the place, and the bees build propolis between the frames. And then when they try to squeeze it together now there's not enough room, because they were kind of careless about how they reposition their frames back. And so you want to have room so that you have the room to pull this frame back in order to get it out. Okay, so that's just something to be mindful about. Once I've got my frames in here, then my smoker hopefully is still going at this point. You've got your 5 frames that you don't have room for in here, but you've got a nuke box that can accept those, but you probably have some bees that are walking around in here too. And so usually what I do is take this box, and you can kind of give it a thump or two and then pour the bees inside here. Or often what I'll do is just set the nuke box here and allow the bees to find their way into this colony. Once you bring the queen into this box, these bees will quickly figure out that they're no longer living here, they're living here, and they'll slowly make their way out into this box here. Once they have, then you can store your 5 frames back in this box, put the lid back on if there's no bees there, and you can put that into storage. Or if you ever have an opportunity to catch a swarm, this works great. So the bees are here. You're ready to put your feeder on. So we're going to assume that I've already got my sugar syrup in my bucket here. The bees are going to be coming up. And so before I put my inner cover on, I'm going to apply a little bit of smoke to get those bees to run down so I don't smash them. And then I will apply my inner cover. And then I've got my bucket feeder. Now bucket feeders have, the camera probably won't pick this up against my shirt maybe, but there are a number of little holes here in the feeder bucket lid. So you fill this up with syrup, you snap the lid on, and you want to build gravity, a vacuum in this, okay, in this gravity feeder. So away from the colony, usually I take it and flip it upside down, okay? If you have syrup in a 5-gallon bucket that you've poured into this, then flip this over above that bucket so the syrup that leaks out of here goes right back into your feeder bucket, your 5-gallon bucket. And very quickly you'll notice the dripping slows and then comes to a stop. And once that happens, then I take my feeder bucket and I'll put it over this hole, not entirely, but I will leave a little bit of a space, as you can see here, so that bees, if there are any bees that come up here, they have a way of getting back down there. If I cover this hole completely, if there are any bees that are flying around and they land over here, they won't have any way, if I block off this ventilation hole, they won't have any way of getting back down to the nest. So I like to leave that little bit of space so that the bees can still come up and go up underneath the lid and get the syrup, and any bees up here can still get back down. Once I put this feeder bucket on, then I have to have something to set my lid on. And so your other deep, I have here, this one's painted. The other deep would go here on top. If it were my hive, I would probably put something here in this ventilation hole just to keep any of the nosy bees that are around from getting in here and maybe trying to get some of this syrup. And so I would, while I was feeding, I would probably block that off with a piece of tape or something like that. The temperatures aren't going to be crazy hot, and so ventilation on that part isn't going to be as necessary. Usually on my lids, if you don't have a feeder bucket on, you can use your lid. If you put your outer cover on, there's usually enough leeway here where you can go back and forth with it. And if you push this forward, then you allow ventilation. You can use it as an upper entrance. If you pull it back, it eliminates that upper entrance, so the bees can't get in or out of that colony. Okay, so when you have that off and you have your feeder in place, and you use a rim, you can use a deep or you can use 2 empty mediums. What I will often use as ventilation is like a paint stick, a 1 gallon paint stick cut in half. And I usually just lay that across here, and that usually provides about 1/8 of an inch ventilation. And I cover it up. I've got my entrance reducer down to probably a 2 or 3 inch size. And really that's all, that's everything that I can think of for installing, you know, a nucleus colony. So you'd want to be careful with your smoker. I can't stress that enough. The beekeeper who passed away a couple months ago, Bob Graham, we were out at his place and we were talking with his children about a couple times when the fire department had to be called out to his place because of, you know, possible misuse of a smoker. So you don't want that to happen. So be careful with your ashes, be careful with your smoker, and make sure to dispose of all that stuff properly. So that concludes this part of the presentation on installing a nuke, but if she's available, and if Jane wants to join, she's welcome to join the question and answer period for this part. I'm sure we've got questions, and the questions are up on the screen here. Are we still needing volunteers for the nuke to help with the nuke day? Yes, we never do any kind of a formal volunteer list for that, but yes, volunteers are always needed. A lot of hands really make that day go smoothly. And in the past, we've never had any kind of an issue. Usually we call for volunteers and we get a lot of people who show up who are ready to work bees. And I don't remember the time we start. Tim might, is it 5 o'clock in the morning or 6?
4:45.
Yeah, 4:45-ish. And I always tell people, make sure you've had your coffee, make sure you've had your donuts. When you pull up at 4:45, we're there to work. So, you know, that's, we're racing against the sun that's getting ready to rise. And when the sun comes up, the bees do what bees do, and that's they want to fly. So we were trying to keep them in their boxes before they get that chance. So it's a race against the clock. So, okay, come on over.
Sun up is 6:14
Okay,
on
so
the 24th.
So Tim checked, the sun is up at 6:14. So that gives us an hour and a half to get that job done. So we need to get as many volunteers as we can. And if you're a beginner and you don't want to volunteer and you just want to watch, by all means, I always tell people, if you're a beginner and you've never done something like this, you won't get a chance to see that very often. 200 colonies in one spot on a big tractor trailer or a big trailer. So with me is Jane Sueme, owner of Isabee's where we're at. And so we invited Jane to help us with the beginner Q&A.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. Michael, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Do you see any good questions for us?
There's not that many, so I'll just Rachel asked a question. Can you speak on the entrance reducer and what position it should be in each season?
Sure. Is that something that Jane wants to tackle, or give me the?
Sure, I'll comment on that. So entrance reducers, especially if you have a screened bottom board, are not going to block any ventilation really. I recommend starting a colony at the smallest position, even though that's called the winter. This is referred to as a winter and summer positions. I would start off in this position at least for a few days until they establish their guards. And then you can either switch it to the summer or remove it completely. I would add that because of small hive beetle, we are actually suggesting that we reduce the entrances most of the season, either with an entrance reducer or a mouse guard. And there are several different styles of mouse guards on the market. There's, you know, a short, relatively short period in the year where the bees are, when we're in nectar flow and the bees really need to have full in and out access and not get bottlenecked. But for maybe, you know, 7 or 8 months out of the year, a reduced entrance is appropriate, I think, based on their activity and their population. Okay.
Okay. I see one here that I'm reading. The questions are coming up on the screen here. Is there such a thing as over smoking your bees? Will too much smoke damage them? So I don't, yes, you can overdo it with a smoker. I don't know that you would necessarily damage the bees, but they run from the smoke. And so if you went crazy, what you would do in a way, yes, you could damage the bees if you overdo it with the smoker, because this is the bellows. And if you have fuel in here, the more you pump this smoker, the hotter this fuel gets, and you're wanting a nice cool smoke for the bees. And I see this a lot on the nucleus day, pickup day. We have to smoke the bees to get them inside. And I've seen in the dark wee hours of the morning, people going crazy with their smoker, and you'll see fire coming out of the end of this, of the smoker tip. And so, yes, bees are hairy and they need a little cool smoke to be convinced to move where you want them to go and to let them know that you're there. A couple puffs is usually all that's needed. But if you keep going crazy with this, yes, you'll get a lot of heat. And so don't feel, you should check your smoker against your hand, you know, and if it's too hot for you, it's too hot for the bees. So, you know, back it up. A puff or two is usually all that's necessary. Okay.
All right, next one. Should I pick one?
Pick one. Pick one.
Notched inner covers. There's a summer position and a winter position. So in the summer, the notch should go up and to the back. So the notch, here's the notch. So the position in the summer up into the back allows the bees to fan at the entrance, and they quite literally can draw air across the brood nest from the back of the hive to thermoregulate, to keep the brood at incubation temperature. In the winter time, we recommend flipping the inner cover over, bringing the notch to the front. So the bees are all clustered in the winter. They're not going to be drawing air in and out of the hive, but they're going to be shedding moisture as they respire. So they're a living organism in the hive. They have moisture in their bodies. That moisture is respiration, and it can collect on the underside of the inner cover. So the notch here allows for a little bit of airflow at the entrance to keep this dry, so that the moisture doesn't condense and then drip down onto them. So that's winter position and summer position.
Very good. I see a question here. Where do people go on Saturday to volunteer for Nuke Day? So let me just confirm this. So the nukes will be delivered to the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center. We're not sure which Saturday yet. We think probably in 2 Saturdays from now, but that's not been confirmed. So once we have a confirmed date, there'll be an email that'll be sent out, and we will probably be shooting for, what'd you say, 5:45? No, 4:45. 4:45 a.m. at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center on Olive, right across from where Bayer now is, where Monsanto used to be called, on Olive and Creve Coeur. There's a parking lot that we always tell people you can't miss it. It's the only part of the parking lot that has a huge trailer that has 200 colonies of bees on it. So it's hard to miss. And there'll be a lot of people in white suits out there running around it. And again, so yes, volunteers, but we need to wait until we confirm which day that is. Okay. Here's a good one. This is a good one for Jane. How soon do you check on the nuke after you've installed it into its full-size equipment?
Sure. We recommend weekly inspections. So if you install your nuke on a weekend, if you pick it up on Saturday, install it on Saturday or Sunday, depending on the weather, you're going to check it in a week. And if you use the gallon feeder that you can buy at the pickup day, that's an appropriate amount of feed for the bees to process in 1 week. Just keep in mind, they're not necessarily eating that feed, they're moving it. So they're using it to stimulate their wax glands, they're building comb with that wax, and then they're storing syrup in it. So they're drawing it out of the bucket and they're processing it in the hive, and you don't need to check on it in 3 days or 4 days, and if it's empty, refill it. You need to give them time to process. So 1 gallon, and check it and replace it if need be every week until they build the majority of the frames in the box, and then of course you're expanding by adding the next box.
Correct. Yeah. So the only thing I would add is that usually we go by, and I mentioned this in the first half of the talk to the advanced beekeepers, but for the beginners, if you weren't present for that, usually when the bees are actively working on, depending on what book you read, 7 frames, 8 frames of the existing box, or let's say 80% of the frames, depending on what size. Some people might have 8-frame equipment. Then it's probably time for your next box. And so when you're feeding, at least for me, I keep my bees primarily in what I call double deep fashion. So there's 2 deep boxes. And so I would be feeding them while they were drawing out the comb and the frames here on the lower deep, and then the upper deep as well. And when I got to that 80% mark on my upper box, that's usually when the colony is strong enough that I can discontinue feeding. And it's now time to think of a 3rd story, which would be a super. So I usually feel that it's easier to give the bees the syrup they need to move things along at a pretty good clip. It allows them to draw frames out much faster. Okay.
I get a lot of questions about ants, and my response generally is that the ants are attracted to the feed. They're not disturbing the bees, especially if they're just up in the inner cover. I know we don't like to see them there, but you know, ants and bees kind of coexist in nature where they live in trees. So as much as we don't like them, you don't need to do anything about it unless you see, like I have one customer that literally installed their hive stands on top of an ant colony, and that was apparent immediately because they were all over the hive stand. But just to have a few ants in the feeder, the bees can deal with it, we need to deal with it, and like John said, you're feeding until they get essentially 80% of their comb drawn, and then you're going to be taking the feeder away. So it's not something that they'll deal with for a long time.
And if it makes you feel better, brush the ants off with your brush that you get with your hive kit. That'll make you feel better, and then reassemble everything, and hopefully they'll not become a nuisance. Another thing that we see, that I see, it's a great question Rachel's got here. A lot of times the nucleus colony that you get has a lot of honey, you know, they're really well equipped as a little nuke. And when you give them additional syrup, they will sometimes take it very rapidly, and sometimes they're slow taking it in. So it all depends on the colony's needs and their need to build and make more space and more room. So depending on how the colony looks, if you have a feeder on them, and let's say it's been a couple weeks and you notice they're not taking it, and the outer frames of that 5-frame nucleus box were solid honey, you know, what I will often do is pull those frames and space them out one and put a frame of foundation there, because sometimes those frames of honey, if they're just solid wall-to-wall honey, it almost acts like 2 walls on both sides of the nest, and they don't realize, hey, there's additional room on the outside of that. And so I'll move the honey frames over one and put frames of foundation in. If they start working on that, maybe I do it again the following week and move those frames of honey, so that eventually the honey frames are on the edge and they've built out the combs inside there. So
Can I add that as long as you see them making progress, whether they're getting it from the feeder or they're getting it naturally from the environment, that the bottom line is you want them to build comb. So you can check your feeder if it still is 80% and it's not getting spoiled or rancid, I don't know what you call it, but leave it on. But if they're going out and getting natural stuff and they're making progress in building comb, that's, you know, ultimately what you want to see.
And I kind of answered this already, but I just want to expand on it. I see there's a question. How long in the season do you feed them sugar solution? So like we said, if your goal is to put them into 2 deep boxes, when they are about 80% drawn on the lower box, you add your second box and you continue to feed until they're about 80% done with the top box. And that's when you're at the point where you stop feeding and you put a 3rd story on. And they should be strong enough to continue that process and continue to build and start drawing out the foundation in the super on their own. But you never want to be feeding and have supers on, because what they'll do is they will just take the sugar syrup you've given them and draw comb and store that sugar syrup in that super. And then you get excited that you've got honey, and you don't have honey. What you have is the sugar syrup that you gave your bees. So that's when you want to stop feeding. You either have supers on or you have feeders on, but never both at the same time. Okay. Technical question from Anonymous. Do you press the queen box into the wax between 2 frames, or do you hold the queen box by sandwiching between the top bars?
What do you do?
Well, it depends. I mean, if I have comb, then usually by simple fact that there's comb on those frames, when you slide that down and push it together, you're going to embed her a little bit into the wax comb on the frames. But I usually do it vertical, between the frames, candy side up, so that she is down kind of in the nest as much as possible. You know, on my, what do they call them? The plastic nukes, the easy nukes or whatever they're called. The easy nukes have enough space above that I actually will set the queen cage between 2 frames, kind of like this, and the bees just come right up all over. They just swarm the cage. So I feel pretty comfortable that she's going to be okay. I only do that because there's that additional space above, but normally it would be vertical between the frames, sandwiched together a little bit, and the wax helps keep her in place. But again, you could do it different ways.
It also helps if you can get it far enough down into the comb that you can snuggle it together a little bit more, and it won't spread your frames apart as much. as if you have them actually between the top bars of the frames. They likely will build a comb in that space because it's more than bee space. And I get this question a lot, well, what should you do about that? Hopefully you're releasing your queen and not dropping it, but releasing your queen soon enough that whatever comb they build is small enough and they haven't put resources in it that you would just remove it. You really need to take the cage out at the appropriate time, remove any errant comb, and push the frames together. And I know John probably covered this. I would also add that if you have a feeder in the middle of the hive, utilizing the hole in the inner cover, you don't want to put the queen in the middle of the hive, even though that kind of you feel like that's where she should be. But if you're using a feeder like that, you want to move her off center and more towards the back than in the front. And I don't know if I've ever read anything about this or if it's really just the front is vulnerable to robbers, even though that doesn't really happen in the spring. I just like to have her towards the back.
I would say the back would be warmer on those cool evenings. And usually the recommendation is that your hive is tipped a little bit forward so that rainwater doesn't accumulate on the bottom board. And so if your SERP bucket were to leak, I would prefer, like Jane said, I would prefer that she is back on high ground than down front where syrup could possibly get to her. So yes, if you're requeening and you're feeding, then definitely that's something to pay attention to. I did not mention that combination of feeding and requeening at the same time, but it's good to be mindful that you don't want the sugar syrup to leak at a rate that could drown your queen. That would be a bad thing. That'd be bad. So we got a question from the audience.
It's an earlier question that's not coming up on your feed.
Okay.
So on Saturday, we want to add a new queen to a particularly mean hive. Today, we couldn't find the old queen, but did find supersedure cells. Since the bees themselves obviously want a new queen, can we put the new queen in her cage without killing the old since we couldn't find her? There was some capped worker brood present. If we remove the supersedure cells, will the bees choose to keep the new younger queen over their own old queen?
Not if you don't remove the old queen. The current queen is their queen, and you can add 10 queens in cages and they're going to kill all those queens. Even though she's a dud, she's their queen and they understand and recognize her pheromones. And so the only way that I would say, if it was my hive, I would put a queen excluder between, I would remove the cells, put a queen excluder between the second box and the first box, and then come back, if you can see eggs, come back in 3 or 4 days and see where there are eggs. Because the eggs, after 3 days, they hatch. And so that would help give you an idea of where the queen is at, which would make finding her a little easier if you know what box she's in. So aside from pulling her out, you could separate those 2 boxes. If you know that there's eggs in one box and there's no eggs in the bottom box, I would requeen the bottom box with the queen that you bought. And you could at a later time try to combine them and hopefully fight it out and get rid of the old queen. But there's no guarantee that when 2 queens fight, that the one that you want to win is going to win. And so, that's one thing you can try to do. You could shake. I mean, sometimes I've seen people shake all the bees down into a box and then put the brood frames in a box and put a queen excluder between them so that the worker bees will all go right up through the queen excluder to get back onto that brood, but the queen cannot get through that. Neither can drones. And so again, that's something that you might try to use in order to help find your queen. But generally speaking, if you haven't removed the old queen, they're not going to accept your new queen. They'll kill her. As soon as you release her, they'll kill her.
There is a possibility there, I don't know what the chances of this are, but there's a possibility that if the supersedure cells are far enough along, they may have already replaced her, not replaced her. They may have already done away with her.
Mhm.
So there's the possibility that you see supersedure cells and you can't find your queen because she's no longer there. That would be called an emergency cell. So you can do what John's suggesting, or you may just put off putting the new queen in and giving it another week. Cut the supersedure cells so that you're trying to keep them from raising a new queen. So cut the supersedure cells, give it another week, do a full inspection, and if you see no eggs, and even more so, I would say no eggs, and they're filling brood cells with nectar, that would be a really good indication that there is no queen, and then you could introduce a queen. But I know that queens arrive and you got a
Exactly.
time, it's a timing thing.
Exactly. And so if you have a queen and you want to go that route, one of the things you can try is if you find open brood or you have some brood, pull, 3 or 4 frames of brood. Basically, you want to take your queen and make a nucleus colony for your queen.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't find the old queen, you can take frames of brood out, shake all the bees off, and put them into a box, a deep box, okay? And then put a queen excluder on top of your second deep. And when you put the third deep on that has the brood in it, the worker bees, the nurse bees are going to come up and take care of that. You can then open up the top and you can reliably take those frames out and put them into your nuke box, because there'll be worker bees all over it, but you'll know that your queen isn't on that. So you can pull those frames out, no queen, put your queen that's in a cage in there so that those bees are taking care of her until you come up with a better solution to your queen issue.
So you figure out if you have a queen or not.
Exactly. Beekeeping can get very complicated when you run into these issues, and the best direction to go sometimes isn't always very clear. And so sometimes I always tell people, just try something. And if you have an understanding of beekeeping biology, then if I do this, the bees are going to respond by doing this. And you use that to kind of help get you through some of these kind of bizarre situations. So,
Transporting bees, temperature?
transporting bees and when it's warm?
What temperature is good for bees when transporting them?
Well, whenever you're transporting them, like let's say home from the nuke day, you have to take them home. That doesn't matter what the temperature is, because we can't let them sit there. But if I'm moving a colony, I've moved colonies that were, in 40-degree weather. Usually it works out. The cooler the weather, the less chance I have to worry about bees overheating. I don't have to worry about having additional ventilation because of that being an issue. The earlier in the season I move them, the cooler it is, but also probably the lighter they'll be, because once I start putting supers on, it become more unwieldy and difficult to carry and move around. But usually 50, 60 degrees is usually what I like to move bees around. I don't like to wait till it gets 90 and then try to move colonies. Yeah.
I'm assuming they're referring to a nuke. So if you're picking up a nuke on Saturday and it's not scheduled to be hot, I think you're going to be fine. But I guess you have had years where it's been pretty warm, and there are concerns with maybe putting them in a trunk and traveling for 2 miles. You probably don't want to do that. When I've had to do something like that, I'll actually stop and get them out of the trunk and set them out and let them get some fresh air. You could do that, or you could take them home and pull the screen and let them fly so that they're not overheating in a nuke if you need to take them further. I guess I'm kind of reading into the question.
Okay.
That they may be wanting to transport them to, you know, a couple of hours away. And I think if it's really cool, the better, you know, it's better if it's cool. It's even nice if it were raining and rather than getting overheated, but letting them fly, I think as soon as possible is advised.
Exactly. Yeah, so even if it is raining the day that you get your nukes, like I said earlier, you put them on top of, or you could put them right next to where they're gonna go. And at a minimum, you wanna pull the entrance screens so that they can go at their leisure. When it warms up, they're gonna come out. If it's too cold, they're gonna stay inside. So if you know, if I could program the weather for Saturday, I think that, you know, 50 degrees and a light mist of rain is perfect. It's not perfect for me, but I know those bees are going to be inside those boxes and they're not going to want to come out, and that's going to be perfect for anyone traveling with bees. That's going to be ideal. So, okay. If that's the last question.
And it's 9 o'clock.
And it's, so thank you everyone who joined us. I see we still have around 56 people still tuned in. That's fantastic.
Okay.
Thanks again, and good luck. And hopefully we got to all the topics we wanted to handle tonight. Thank you to Mike Wagner for helping with the Q&A, and for Tim Hyde for all of his technical assistance tonight. And thank you again to Jane and Scott for allowing us to hold this here at Isabee's. So thanks everyone. Good night.
But Scott doesn't want me to stop.
Can you still utilize the 2-camera system even after the Zoom, if you have a Zoom?
I can always start another one.
Well, that's true. Let's do a test. Go ahead, Mary.